Thanks a lot, Lalita, for this generous introduction, and thanks for coming. This talk is primarily presenting the arguments that I have made in my book. Things have moved forward quite a bit since then, and with the current political regime in the US, the current president, things are changing dramatically, and if you have been paying attention, there was an incident in Kansas which happened a few weeks back, and that really shook the community in a big way. So what I'm presenting here speaks to some of the developments that are unfolding, but I will be focusing on some of the ways in which I have tried to understand South Asian communities in the past 10 to 15 years in terms of their political participation. So I would start with a reference to an exhibition which was organized in DC in 2014. The exhibition was called Beyond Bollywood, Indian Americans Shape the Nation. It was the first exhibition on Indian Americans which was organized at Smithsonian, which was a big deal. This is the poster for that exhibition. And the exhibition displayed diverse stories ranging from railroad and farm workers in the 19th and 20th century who were denied the right to citizenship to spelling bee champions, H-1B visa professionals, taxi drivers, and Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. It also included the victims of hate violence after 9/11. The exhibition was an attempt to create a narrative of Indian American contributions by going beyond stereotypes and cliches. It elicited high praises for celebrating the place of Indian American community within the larger American society. However, the exhibition also evoked criticism that other South Asian communities, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Sri Lankan, and others, were made invisible in its storytelling. Some wondered whether an exhibition about Desi Americans that could bring their shared culture, language, racial experience together was even possible. The exhibit was critiqued as a parochial and hegemonic approach by an Indian American community, a community that does not want to be inclusive and tends to marginalize the experiences of other South Asian communities. Critics also talked about the internal fissures, arguing that LGBT experiences as well as the issue of caste within the Indian American community were not addressed adequately. The exhibition has undoubtedly created a complex story of Indian Americans, but the process of curating Indian American identity and subsequent reactions to the exhibition underline the fact that such visibility makes privilege an identity that is in reality more complex and contested. My presentation engages precisely with these cleavages and contestation to analyze the political mobilization and participation patterns that have emerged from the community. South Asian Americans are a part of the successive waves of immigrant and minority groups that have struggled for inclusion in the US political process. There is a substantive body of scholarship that has looked at the mobilization and incorporation patterns of different immigrant groups. The scholarship on immigrant and minority political incorporation is a term which is coming out mostly of political science and sociology, but we can replace that term by political inclusion. But the term that is used in political science is political incorporation. So the scholarship on political incorporation or inclusion has been shaped by two dominant models. One that has emerged from the classic group experience of European immigrants to the US, early 20th century, late 19th century. And the second one shaped by African American experience in the post-civil rights period. Pluralist model and minority group or racialization model. The pluralist model, based on the early European immigrant experience, underscores the relative openness of the political process and predicts a bumpy but complete inclusion of contemporary non-white immigrants in mainstream political institutions. So think about Italian, Irish, and they faced hurdles, but ultimately they were included, became a part of larger white identity. The literature grew out of a large corpus of work that was broadly categorized under the rubric of assimilation framework, primarily coming out of sociology. In contrast, the racialization model or minority group model underscores the barriers of political inclusion faced by African Americans as the paradigmatic case of obstacle to minority incorporation. This model, which is coming out of African American experience primarily, predicts that the new non-white immigrants, whether we think Latinos, Asian Americans, Caribbeans, the model predicts that these new non-white immigrants will also reproduce the experience of African American political incorporation, which would mean partial, halting, and incomplete inclusion, and a reliance on race-based mobilization. Both the model, if you look at these two models, they have contrasting predictions about the extent and pace of inclusion of contemporary non-white immigrants. So, for pluralists, it's faster, complete. For race-based theory or minority group model, it would be very slow and incomplete. But there is one thing which is common in both the models, and that's an important part of how I engage with these two models. Both these models emphasize the central importance of unified ethno-racial mobilization for group political incorporation. So communities would organize around their ethnic or racial identity, and that would allow them to negotiate with the political process. Right? In case of minority group model, ethno-racial mobilization is an enduring feature, whereas the pluralist model considers such mobilization only as temporary until the group becomes a part of the mainstream economic and political process. Both agree that a unified ethno-racial mobilization is the way through which minorities achieve some level of political efficacy, leading to greater political inclusion. So, the argument that emerges from both these models is that new immigrant groups would mobilize around their ethno-racial identity, and that's how they will enter the political process. Looking at South Asian experience, I argue that the political mobilization and inclusion of South Asian communities in the US is deeply tied to internal group distinctions. We have to think about internal differentiation, distinctions within the community. Furthermore, the precise nature of ethno-racial mobilization could be better explained by foregrounding these important cleavages within the community. And when I'm talking about cleavages, I'm talking about cleavages along the lines of class, occupation, religion, nation of origin, gender, sexuality, and caste. The South Asian experience, and this is what I'm going to argue, the South Asian experience suggests that the notion of unified mobilization, whether it's Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi unified, or South Asian unified, is complicated by these internal cleavages. I also argue that a unified ethno-racial mobilization is not a precondition for political representation and influence, and we see a trend where two become disconnected. So political representation is not dependent on how unified the community is, and I'll present some evidence to illustrate why I make this argument. So to illustrate this argument, I talk about two things. I'll present my analysis of two different spheres of political mobilization among South Asian Americans. The first looks at the racialization of South Asians in the post-9/11 period, and the second one is concerned with political participation, particularly in the electoral arena in the US, and attempts at representation in the political sphere. The first part of my presentation looks at the impact of racial hostility against South Asians in the wake of 9/11 attacks, and the ways in which different segments of the community reacted to the hostility. When we look at the period after 9/11 attacks, it was clear that religious identities not only became an important axis for racialization of South Asians, but they also shaped the mobilization against racialization. So religion was important in terms of how they were racialized, what meanings were attributed to them, but it also played a role in how they reacted to racial targeting, racialization. I look at the post-9/11 moment to analyze the challenges of building political solidarity among South Asians to contest racialization. The evidence suggests that in reaction to 9/11 attacks, there was a lumping of all South Asians alongside Arab Americans on the basis of their appearance as outsiders, suspicious, and threatening. One of the most important dynamics of racialization is the lumping of diverse groups into homogeneous racial categories on the basis of apparent physical similarity, whereby internal distinctions are completely suppressed in the eyes of outsiders. Different Asian American groups, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese, being seen as the same is a classic illustration of this phenomenon. Some scholars have argued that racialization process is directly linked to the possibilities of forming a broader pan-ethnic solidarity. External threats lead to the intensification of group cohesion as members react in defensive solidarities and develop common interests where none may have existed. According to this framework, a distinct possibility of a solidarity-based pan-ethnic mobilization, and by pan-ethnic I mean South Asian, where Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankans, they all come together and mobilize, right? So if we believe in this framework, then there is a possibility that South Asians will come together to challenge racialization, to challenge hate crime in the post 9/11 period. And I make the argument that when we look at South Asians, it presents a different picture. We don't see that kind of solidarity emerging in the post 9/11 period, and I'm going to present some of the evidence to illustrate that. The impact of racial hostility on South Asian communities was reflected in interviews that I conducted with Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshis in New York and Los Angeles in 2006 and 7. So all the quotes are from those interviews. The respondents came from diverse religious backgrounds: Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshis. But all the interviewees acknowledge so I was talking to them in 2006 and 7, 5 years after 9/11 attacks, and all of them acknowledge that they are facing racial hostility and they are facing some level of lumping based on their physical appearance. I talked to a Gujarati Hindu interviewee based in Los Angeles who expressed his feeling in the following words. Well, when they look at us, they always think we are from somewhere else. Because of our skin color, maybe they think that we are all terrorists or something. I don't know. They try to connect us to those people, 9/11 attackers. Speaking of Muslim experiences, a young Muslim immigrant of Pakistani origin based in Brooklyn, New York, expressed his fears in the following words. There was genuine suspicion of Muslims and defensiveness toward Muslims. Just makes you walk around the streets much more carefully. I have learned to be much more defensive in public situations. Certain people get angry, not everyone. I just mean have a defensive, self-protective demeanor. It is important to note here that the targeting of Muslims in the post-9/11 period had a distinct dimension that other South Asian communities, Hindus, Sikhs, and Christians, largely escaped. That related to a very systematic focus of law enforcement agencies on Muslim communities, leading to surveillance, detention, deportation, and shutting down of Muslim charity organizations. The racial lumping of South Asians points towards the fungibility of the racial construction of those appearing to be Muslims in the post-9/11 period. And here I draw upon some scholars who have looked at this. So Letty Wolf, a legal scholar, she argues that the category of those who appear Middle Eastern, Arab, or Muslim is socially constructed and heterogeneous. Persons of many different races and religion, including Hindus, Sikhs, Muslim, Christian, and in many cases even Latinos, have been included in this category. Middle Eastern or Muslim, instead of being a descriptive category, has become a racial signifier. Munir Ahmad argues that the construct of Muslim looking is in the post-9/11 period is neither religion nor conduct based. In other words, you do not have to be a Muslim to be Muslim looking. Muslim looking is a racial category that has emerged in this period. This process has further intensified in the last couple of years with presidential primaries and the election. Now, when we look at the responses of different South Asian communities to racial targeting in the post-9/11 period, it was apparent that they broke down along the lines of religious identity, with a certain amount of slippage between religious and national identity. I'll present a couple of quotes just to give you a sense of what the reactions were. So I asked a community member based in New York, a Hindu Indian community leader who has been based in the US for a very long time, about the possibility of organizing against hate crime in the post-9/11 period. And part of his response was this. Hindus must be supporting Sikhs on that sort of campaign, but I don't see any way that Pakistanis, Indians, and Bangladeshis can meet. Religion is a big divide, it really is. It is not only a feeling, but it is there in practical life also. Even in India, I think Hindus don't trust Muslims, whether Muslims would go for India or for Pakistan. The statement points to fault lines within South Asian community and the possible hurdles to a unified response to racial targeting. Obviously, there is a clear slippage here between national origin and religious affiliation, with this assumption that India is equivalent to Hindu, which can't be more wrong. There was a clear attempt to foreground an Indian Hindu identity and distance from identities that included others, particularly Muslims, Arabs, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis. India's Consul General in New York, Sashi Tripathi, was reported in multiple media outlets in the wake of 9/11 attacks about the precautions Indians should be taking to avoid hate violence. He said, and I quote here, "We are also considering asking Indian women to wear bindis as a distinguishing mark. Right now, everybody should be careful." I'm sure most people here know that bindi is a dot that most Hindu Indian women wear traditionally, and it's traditionally seen as a marker of Hinduism, even that is contested. It is very important to note that the assertion of a distinct religious identity and distancing from Muslims was not happening only among Muslim South Asians. This process could be seen playing out, although a little differently, among Sikh Americans also. An Indian American Muslim from New York metropolitan area pointed to the ways in which Sikhs reacted to post-9/11 environment. And I partly quote him about what he said. He said, "I have seen Sikhs with posters saying we are not Muslims. It was shocking actually, but I guess I could understand. They were the ones targeted most. So that way everybody tried to distance themselves from Muslims within the community." So post-2001 period, quite a few organizations were formed, particularly within Sikh community, and it was a period in which many organizations came into existence and they stabilized, they became powerful within the community. And it happened because Sikh community bore the brunt of racial targeting in the post-9/11 period. So Sikh organizations that were formed after September 11th attacks were very quick not to follow the line of reasoning articulated in the phrase, "We are not Muslims." They moved away from that idea. So if you think about SALDET, if you think about Sikh coalition, they were very careful not to push this idea forward. However, mobilization against racial targeting in the post-9/11 period among Sikhs developed primarily on the lines of religious identity. The Sikh mobilization focused primarily on the attacks on Sikhs, and there has been an emphasis on educating the law enforcement agencies as well as the general public about Sikh religious identity. Groups such as Sikh Coalition, American Legal Defense Fund, SALDET, and other such groups have worked consistently not only against hate crime against Sikhs, but also on the long-standing issues of discrimination against Sikhs in employment, including military services. That has been a big part of their campaign. Similar patterns of mobilization were witnessed among Muslim communities. Groups such as Council for American Muslim Care, Muslim Public Affairs Council, MPAC at the national level, and Council of Pakistani American Affairs in Los Angeles, and a coalition of Muslim groups in New York City have been leading tremendous amount of work in fighting racial targeting. In fact, Sikh and Muslim groups mobilized their communities against racial and religious targeting successfully by deploying religious identity and using religious institutions, gurdwaras and mosques particularly, to increase community participation on this issue. It is important to note here that there was a presence of pan-ethnic South Asian mobilization, and that has been reflected in the works of progressive groups such as SALT, South Asian Americans Leading Together, based in Desi, South Asian Network in Los Angeles, DRUM in New York City. Despite that, I would say that religious identity-based mobilizational framing against post-9/11 racialization has registered a powerful presence in the South Asian community. Some of these groups These religious groups have drawn upon the framework that progressive Black, Latino, and Asian American organizations have adopted in the post-civil rights period. These groups seem to be open to broader anti-racial coalitions. Prime examples are against the coalition SALDEF, CARE, Impact, and Muslim advocates among Muslims. Others have limited themselves to liberal multicultural framework that does not go beyond seeking recognition and respect for their communities and religious groups. Still others have adopted a conservative approach towards forming alliances with other religious groups. And here I would point to Hindu American Foundation, based in DC, one of the more organized groups among Indian Americans. So to conclude this section, we witnessed distinct mobilization within the community where religious identity plays an important role. In some cases, they are able to come together to challenge hate crime and targeting, but there are enough examples of drifting apart, pointing to the challenges of creating a unified mobilization against racialization. Religion is an important distinction within the community, and that has produced distinct mobilization in the post-colonial period, demonstrating the challenges of unified mobilization. And now I want to move to my second example, which is much more in the electoral arena. And one of the important things about South Asian community or Indian American community is that the way the community is settled in different places, there are no concentration of South Asians, there are no ethnic enclaves, and that has been primarily because of the migration patterns. So South Asians are scattered all over the country, and even in areas where there is a larger number of South Asians, there are no ethnic neighborhoods, right? What that means is that they can't rely on that concentration to build some kind of political efficacy, to build some kind of, or to think about an electoral district which is majority or a very high number of South Asians, right? So I looked at some data and I found that there is a unique trend among South Asians, particularly among Indian Americans, and that unique trend is about South Asians contesting mostly from white majority districts, right? So they are contesting from districts which are 60, 70, 80% white, and they are in places like Kansas, Ohio, Minnesota, very white areas, and that has been a trend. And so I'm going to show you a couple of tables that that has electoral districts. So these are electoral districts. These are candidates. These are congressional contests, state level contests. I have Nikki Haley and Bobby Jindal also included here, but there are many more, right? And it goes on to the second one. And on this, in this column, you'll see the racial demographic, right? And the stars in after the name indicates that those candidates actually succeeded. So this is a list of candidates who contested, and looking at this list, it's very clear that over the last 15 years, I would say, there has been a consistent and significant trend of South Asians contesting from white majority districts and even succeeding from there. And what does that mean? That means they don't have to mobilize their co-ethnics. They're not entering the political process as ethnic candidates. They don't have to mobilize their co-ethnics, and they are primarily entering the political arena as non-ethnic candidates who are trying to persuade white voters, right? And so their political representation is not dependent on the mobilization of the community, right? So if you go back to the models where there was this idea that ethnic mobilization would lead to greater representation, you see here that there is a disconnect between ethnic mobilization and representation, and this trend has stayed on. And parallel to this trend, there is also a trend of South Asian candidates contesting from districts which have some level of South Asian concentrations. So there are 2 or 3 areas where concentrations are building. So think about Northern California, think about New Jersey, think about New York. So there are those areas also. So we see that trend also, where there are attempts to build those ethnic concentrations, and some intervention in redistricting debate also, particularly at city council level, you see in New York City, right? So to build that concentration. But the trend of trying to get elected from white majority district is a very, very strong trend, and that is a big part of how South Asians, particularly Indian Americans, are entering into the political process. Approximately 76% of contestants have run from districts that are more than 60% white. What does this mean? How does it compare to the traditional models of political representation that is driven by unified ethno-racial mobilization, particularly when we think of Latinos and African Americans? It is distinct from the traditional mode of minority representation that is dependent on mobilization of one's own racial or ethnic group. Indian American candidates obviously are not reaching out for the votes of co-ethnics, and in most cases they are not appealing to, in most cases they're appealing to an overwhelming white constituent, right? And the classic example is Nikki Haley and Bobby Jindal, but they actually do not capture this trend because many of these candidates are from Democratic Party also, and actually a large number of them are from Democratic Party, and they have not necessarily adopted Bobby Jindal, Nikki Haley path. So there are things one can there are ways in which one can differentiate between those 2 examples and what's going on in terms of contestation. So this trend of representation does little to bring co-ethnics into the political process in terms of naturalization, registration, and voting. So in political science, there is this whole literature which suggests that immigrants enter into the political process when co-ethnics contest. When Latinos are contesting, they are reaching out to Latinos in the district to naturalize, to register, to vote, right? And that's how an ethnic group enters into the political process. But you see, in case of Asian Americans, none of that. In case of Indian Americans, none of that is happening, right? But there is one kind of co-ethnic mobilization that I have noticed, and that has been widely reported in press. So these candidates who are contesting from white majority district, they reach out to their co-ethnics across the country for campaign contributions. There is evidence that a sizable part of the money is raised from co-ethnics. So anybody contesting from, let's say, a very white district in Ohio would do a tour of Chicago, San Francisco, New York, New Jersey, organize fundraisers in the community, appealing to co-ethnics. And so you see that kind of reach out. But it's important to know that it's a very small segment of the community, and it's also the segment which is financially well off. And I term this as mobilizational process limited only to the elite. So my last example is about South Asian elite and a trend that I noticed while looking at South Asians and their electoral participation. South Asians have played a major role in presidential elections in terms of bundling campaign contributions. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term bundlers. These are people who organize fundraisers and invite their co-workers, people from family, friends, larger network. People come together and they bundle contributions, right? And those range anywhere from $50,000 to $500,000. That's the range. And I noticed that Indian Americans have been playing a major role, particularly in presidential elections, to organize those fundraisers. And there are many names. Frank Islam, if anybody is familiar with him, he's based in Chicago area, one of the major bundlers. So I I looked at campaign contribution data, and I found that so I have data from 2012 presidential election, and if you look at the data, there were 769 bundlers who contributed to Obama in 2012 elections, and out of 769, I was able to identify 27 South Asians, right? So that's huge, right? Out of 769, 27 South Asians. And the way I did it, I just went by last name and tried to figure out who is. And I thought more or less I was able to, maybe I missed somebody, maybe one or two, but mostly I was able to get it. And then through Google search, I figured out where they're coming from, what their background was, right? So 27 out of 769, and so here is the list, the money that they contributed. So 500,000. So these are huge amount, and these are all very affluent, rich people. Maybe is there a relative here? Someone's very rich people, and some of them are very well known. Reshma Sudani working on Wall Street. Shefali, Dugal. So mostly Indian Americans, a couple of Pakistani Americans, and so here is the amount, and here is the appointments that they got, right? So many of them got appointed to different kinds of positions, and they are listed, and the list goes on. Clearly, you can see Deepak Chopra is there, so you know that name. So it's and these are all Obama fundraisers. I did not look at Romney because they were mostly Democratic. Romney did not have too many South Asians, but I did not look at that. And my guess is that in this election also you will see similar pattern. So it's very clear that involvement of South Asians in fundraising is disproportionately higher, and what is happening due to this process is that a small number of South Asians are getting political leverage, influence, placement in political arena, but that is not necessarily linked to any kind of linkage to what we call ethnic mobilization, right? And so there is that disconnect that you see where politics is moving away from the traditional models of mobilizing. I want to conclude by just briefly looking at the electoral preferences of South Asians and how that is shaping up, and what does that tell us about how South Asians are voting. So there are two major surveys that I'm going to show you. This is 2012, and Asian Americans in general have become largely democratic, but within Asian Americans, Indians are the most democratic. So if you see 84% voted Democratic in 2012. 2016 we had a survey right before the election, and here also you can see some people are undecided, but Indians again were overwhelmingly Democratic, and I think this pattern has held up even during the election, and I think there is data now going to come out, but it's very clear that Asian Americans in general are democratic, but Indian Americans are more democratic, and here is data on a policy issue. So one of the questions that was asked in the survey was, during the election, how do you feel about banning Muslims from entering US? And if you think about India and the politics in India and Hindu-Muslim relationship, all of that, you would think that maybe they would say that, okay, they're in favor of that, but you clearly see that Indians are, among Asian Americans, Indians are highest in terms of opposing Muslim bans. So what I take from this data is that there is a fair amount of political cohesion that we see emerging within the Indian American community, and so on one hand there is the whole argument that I made through my presentation that there is internal distinction, internal differentiation, but a particular way of racializing is producing a political cohesion, which is also interesting. So there is some amount of tension that I see between these two trends. So just to conclude, and I'm over my 25 minutes, so I would conclude by saying that there are internal contestations within South Asian community, and the idea of a unified mobilization is faced with many challenges that need to be acknowledged. I talked about internal contestations to the politics that unfolded in post-9/11 period, and how a unified response is very, very difficult. In my book, I have talked about class and occupational distinctions, which I didn't refer here. The trend of white majority district and campaign contribution is also showing that politics there is a separation between ethnic mobilization and political representation. So that also suggests that there is a fair amount of internal differentiation, and ethnic mobilization that is happening within the community is of a very specific kind. So Silicon Valley entrepreneurs are organizing themselves for their own set of demands or their own vision of what they want from the US government or US society, but taxi drivers have different concerns, and they are also engaging in some level of ethnic mobilizing, but that mobilizing is very different. So it's not that there is no ethnic mobilization, but that ethnic mobilization is of very differentiated and desegregated kind, and the idea of unified ethnic mobilization that we see emerging from the literature does not hold true for South Asians. I'll stop here.